Next from the state capitol, we attend a press conference held by State Senator Andy Manar outlining the provisions of Senate Bill 1, which would change the state's education funding formula among other reforms. This runs about 35 minutes.
Today, I filed an amendment to Senate Bill 1, which would reflect much of the work that has gone on over the course of many months, back to when the Senate passed Senate Bill 16, I believe on May the 27th of 2014. So I want to quickly rewind the clock and just go through some of the brief history of the issue, how we got to this point, where we are today in the legislative process, and Representative Davis and Mitchell and myself and Representative Scheer, anybody else who might pop in, we'd like to share our thoughts on where we think the issue is moving forward, given the fact that we're beginning our session here this week. So I want to rewind the clock back to 2013 when the General Assembly came into office following the 2012 election. There was a process in the Senate that took place that opened up a conversation that now I think it's safe to argue is being engaged by nearly every superintendent in the state, which is a good thing in my book. It was a transparent process. It was open. It set up what I think is a good thing, which is open dialogue between the legislature and organizations and school districts, educators, superintendents across the state on how we solve what I think is a major problem in the state of Illinois, and one that continues to grow absent of action from the legislature. So we went through that process in the Senate. We came up with what was a bipartisan report. We put a timeline on ourselves, and I know many in this room have heard me say this, but I'm going to say it again because I think it's important. The Senate said we had to produce a report by February 1st of 2014, and we succeeded, and I compliment the 8 members of the EFAC committee, Democrats and Republicans, for putting their time and effort into that process. That translated into Senate Bill 16. Senate Bill 16, of course, was filed about 2 months before the Senate voted on it, so that everybody in the state would have plenty of time to read the bill, understand its intentions, understand its effects, and give constructive feedback and constructive criticism. The Senate passed the bill on May the 27th, and here we are today with a new set of language that's intended to address much of the criticism that has come our way as sponsors of the bill, and hopefully set forward a path for bringing about a major reform effort in the state of Illinois, a bill that can be bipartisan and one that ultimately Governor Rauner can sign into law. So I want to just do a little bit of classroom work here with everybody. Remember this chart? This was the first chart that we used when the bill was introduced in April of 2014. And it shows simply that 44% of our money is spent on programs where need, some sort of need, is used as a criteria for how money is distributed from the state budget to the 860 plus school districts in the state. That was a snapshot in time when Senate Bill 16 was introduced in the Senate last year. Despite the fact, and this is an important point, despite the fact that the current budget increased investment in education, that number has gone down. It's gone down to about 43.2%, which means that less of a percentage of money that we budget in the state budget this year, despite the fact that we've increased spending for K through 12 education, is being distributed based on need, which means that the neediest districts, those that have the highest rates of poverty and oftentimes the highest rates of taxes, are accessing less money in the state budget, which is opposite of what every expert that we heard from in the Senate and every expert that I would suspect the House has heard from is saying we ought to do as a state. So the path forward, we believe, is Senate Bill 1. And we believe that the path forward can begin with a conversation early this session, which is why we're filing the language today early in the process. Because again, an open and transparent discussion is vital, it's imperative to this conversation. And we stand continued to to take in feedback and take in suggestions from any member of the legislature of either party, from any part of the state, from any educator that has an idea on how to get at this problem and how to get at the gaping inequities that exist today in public schools. So real quick, Senate Bill 16 would have accomplished these things, and these things are all incorporated into now Senate Bill 1. It would have created a single need-based funding formula, a primary state aid formula, which was a suggestion that was brought to us from other states and from experts in the Senate, replacing our outdated grant-based system that exists today in Illinois and that hasn't changed sizably since 1997. We would prioritize state resources to help school districts and students who need them the most. That would be the criteria for how we distribute money. We would weight that heavily in the formula, which means that we would send money first to districts that can't afford to provide an education, a basic education on their own. We would increase transparency by requiring individual school districts to account for how they spend state funds, replacing the old reporting system that exists today. And we would include all districts, including Chicago Public Schools, in a need-based formula that would be a statewide formula to serve every district in the state, regardless of where it is or the size or the makeup of that district. Here are a couple of changes that I think deserve to be mentioned today. Again, these are based off of feedback from members of the House, three of which are here today, members in the Senate, such as Senator Lightford, and others across the state that have been part of this discussion moving forward. One thing we explored in the EFAC hearings was coming up with a regionalization of funding in the state, because Illinois is a complex, very diverse state, and other states have gone to this. So we've incorporated into the language a regionalization approach when it comes to state aid for schools. It's a fact that it costs more to hire a teacher in one part of the state as opposed to another. And other states such as Maryland and Minnesota, Massachusetts, and others have incorporated this into their state aid formula, and it more accurately reflects the challenges of districts. So that proposal is contained in Senate Bill 1. We would keep the current low-income calculation. During the course of the debate of Senate Bill 16, there was much feedback from superintendents in the state that questioned the methodology that was employed in Senate Bill 16. They also coincidentally questioned the methodology that we use today to assess poverty. So we're going to propose this language to try to address that valid point that was made. Much has been made, number three, much has been made of what is adequate. Much of our discussion has revolved around the debate about what is an adequate level of spending for schools. So in the new bill, in Senate Bill 1, we will move that study up so we can determine that I would hope would set us on a positive path forward for many years to come, so that we can determine, using advice from experts, using feedback from educators, what is an adequate level of spending for public education in the state. And right now, we all know that we are way below where we ought to be. But moving the adequacy study up in the bill, I think, would set us on a good framework for a very long-term solution to the problems that we face. Another change that we're proposing in Senate Bill 1 is that we would provide additional funding for districts that are collecting taxes or assessing taxes at or above state averages, but are spending below the calculated adequacy target for a school. So we have districts in the state that are more than providing their share of funding through their tax rate. But we have a set of districts that also were adversely affected by Senate Bill 16. And these districts are ones that have any number of challenges. So we will provide in this bill a targeted hold harmless for these districts to make sure that they are at the minimum level of adequacy moving forward, and that they are not negatively impacted by the changes that we're contemplating. This has a price tag associated with it. So unlike Senate Bill 16, we are acknowledging that there needs to be money invested in a targeted way to the poorest school districts that are taxing themselves at a rate higher than the state average moving forward, so that they're held harmless from any changes in the bill. There's a couple more reporting things. You see those on your sheet. But I want to diverge quickly from the conversation and then turn it over to Representative Davis, the House sponsor. Another thing that we're asking for today as members of the legislature is, I would say, echoing the direction that the State Board of Education took a few weeks ago when they produced under the new board chairman, acting board chairman, a recommended budget for the legislature and for the governor to take a look at this session. And they recommended a dramatic increase in spending for schools. So we today want to echo those sentiments from the state board. And we feel that there should be a minimum of $500 million associated with this bill to invest in a new formula that drives resources to the neediest districts first. That is a different conversation than we had with Senate Bill 16. But talking with my colleagues and talking with others in the legislature, we believe the time is now to take 2 steps to make sizable fixes to the challenges we face in the state when it comes to public education. We have to acknowledge that we have gaping inequities that can be solved by reforming the formula and can also be solved by increasing investment at the same time, some of which will go to what I mentioned in the targeted hold harmless. The rest of it ought to go to an increased investment, which again is what the State Board of Education called for a few weeks ago when they met and released the budget. So that's the overview of the bill. I for one, and I'm one of 59 in the Senate, and there's 118 members in the House. I don't hear too many people saying today that the system that exists, the status quo that we own today as a state, is sufficient for our purposes moving forward. What we need is an active discussion from both parties, from all parts of the state, from individuals, legislators, teachers, superintendents, interest groups, community groups who want to be part of a discussion on how we advance a bill this session that can begin to be phased in the coming school year that accomplishes 2 things. Changes the formula to match the needs of the state today, not the needs of the state almost 20 years ago, and brings about a new level of investment in public education. That to me is the recipe for success. That to me is the recipe to turn around the path that we're on. Because remember, this number is lower today than it was a year ago. The neediest districts are accessing less money today than they were a year ago. Absent of change, that's the path we're on. So we should expect next year that number is going to be lower if the legislature doesn't do the right thing and change the law and invest more. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to the House sponsor, Representative Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Senator Manar. I want to begin by first acknowledging all the hard work that Senator Manar and the Senate EFAC committee have put into getting us to where we are. Senate Bill 16 was a great first step. It really allowed us to examine and to acknowledge a lot of the challenges that exist as it relates to school funding throughout the entire state of Illinois. One theme that we heard over and over again in the conversation about Senate Bill 16 was there also needed to be a conversation about more revenue, about more resources. So, to the senator's credit, as he examined all of the conversation that was had and took place through not only the hearings, but also town hall meetings that were held all over the state. I held one in the 30th district where I'm the representative, and we heard some of those concerns loud and clear, as well as in our offices, that yes, we can talk about taking what we have and redistributing that, but there are still challenges that we've all acknowledged for the need for more revenue to be a part of the conversation. So I'm happy that we have evolved this conversation up to this point to say, yes, we need to add reform, but we also need to talk about more money as well. And that's an important part of the conversation that we heard loud and clear. The House hearing that we had back during veto session, many of the superintendents that sat at the table and all talked about, well, let's do adequacy first. Well, I believe we are smart enough to be able to handle both of these at the same time, but their concern about adequacy was heard loud and clear. And again, as the senator has already stated, what we're going to do is talk about reform and adequacy in the same conversation moving them both forward so that we can work to make sure, as we all, I think, as senators and representatives want, to make sure that schools in the state of Illinois are adequately funded, to make sure that schools of Illinois are providing the best quality of education for all of the students that they have in their buildings, and to make sure that our communities continue to be safe and sustainable. And we know education is a significant part of making sure that our communities are safe and indeed sustainable. So I'm proud to be the House sponsor of Senate Bill 1 and looking forward to continuing this dialogue and having very meaningful dialogue, but working toward passage of this legislation in the House this upcoming session as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will. Kimberly,
Thank you, Senator. Good afternoon. I'm happy to be joined here with the rest of the group because once the Senate EFAC committee did its homework, we neglected to respond to the resource piece because we just really wanted to dive into creating the new weighted formula to address our neediest districts. Now we're at a place where I'm so happy to see that Senator Manar continued to move the subject through the House, and it's wonderful to see Representative Davis and all the other House members here because many people wanted to find out what was going on, what's next, what the House is doing, and it's good to see that the House has been busy working. And so I'm just delighted to continue to stand in the gap for education funding, education reform, the need to make sure all of our children, no matter where they live in the state of Illinois, have the opportunity to receive a high-quality public education. So I commend Senator Manar. The House has work to do. The Senate has work to do with Senate Bill 1. We couldn't have picked a better number. And I'm looking forward to working with him to move this measure again through the Illinois Senate, this time recognizing the need for those resources. And just quickly to ISB's proposal, I think that we still need more funding. It was good to see that they decided this time to do no proration. I had mentioned to you guys before, although there was an increase in funding of the foundation level, it was still prorated at 89%. So taking into account that the proposal is calling for $61.19 per pupil without proration still isn't enough money in the foundation. If you look at EFAP's report, we should be around $8,600 or of the like per pupil. So we're quite a ways under where we should be. And if we actually got to those numbers where we should be, then you would really see this working. You would really see the difference in what adequate funding could make and the changes that could really take shape in our public school system. So I'm just here to be a part of the team that's trying to make sure that all of our kids get a fair shot in Illinois. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am also delighted to be here. This is a bill, this type of bill that I worked on even as a community organizer. It's actually first met Representative Davis and some other folks here. So I'm grateful to Senator Manar, grateful to Representative Davis for bringing this forward. I've said before that I believe that this is the civil rights issue of our time, access to a high-quality public education, and that the idea of somehow dealing with only adequacy and not equity would be very similar to the foolish man who built his house upon the sand, because if we do equity, then we are able to get to adequacy more easily and able to ensure that the kind of resources are coming from the state to make sure that every child, regardless of their zip code, has access to a high-quality education. So I'm honored to be here. I know there are some who've said, well, you know, the House didn't participate in EFAC, or you know, there's this resolution saying let's slow down the process and start over again. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We don't need a blue ribbon commission. And I, you know, participated in some of those EFAC hearings, and so did some House Republicans. So we know what the data says. We know what Massachusetts and other states who have done this well are doing, and the time to do this is right now. So I'm honored to be standing with my colleagues, very grateful for the opportunity, and I believe we're going to get this done. Thank you.
First, I wanted to just thank everyone who took the time out of their day to be here. I'm Representative Sue Scheer, for those of you who don't know me. Thanks first and foremost to Senator Manar for having the courage to start this a long time ago, and to all of our other representatives and senators for being willing to stand up and do the right thing. This is an issue. Our fair school funding has been an issue in teachers' hearts for as long as I was a teacher, which I started teaching in 1978. Remember, the first time I ever voted was voting for a school referendum indicator and seeing how important that was at that time. And in some ways, I can't believe that we're still fighting to get fair funding in the state of Illinois. I think the name couldn't be any more appropriate than to be fair school funding. Because when I think about this, I laid awake last night thinking, I just visited a high school yesterday in Project Read. And when I was sleeping, and then I woke up and I thought, you know, is it fair? Is it fair? Is it fair that some kids get a computer in their classroom and some don't? Is it fair that we all pay taxes for our children to get an education, but we don't get the same fair education? Is it fair that we're all asked to take state examinations where the results are published in the newspapers, and yet some of our students have books and some don't? Some have a library and some don't. Some have computers and some don't. But do we acknowledge any of that when we publish the results? I can answer as a teacher, no, we don't acknowledge that. Is it fair that when our kids go to take the examinations to get into college and take the ACT, that some kids had a computer and some didn't? That some can afford a calculator and some can't? Is it fair that some kids get to eat breakfast and some don't? We have a sense of fairness here, and it's been long too far ignored. And to the courage of the people who stand behind me, I say amen and hallelujah that the time has finally come that we can straighten out the fairness in the way we fund education and the fairness in the way we look at what's important in the state of Illinois. What do we want out of our youth? Do we want to tie our teachers' hands behind their backs? Do we want to say, okay, we can't afford computers, but you go make sure that they can pass a Common Core test? We're going to give them the same length of time to take the test as someone who has a computer at their desk and 20 sitting in the corner and a computer advisor in the room making sure that everybody's computer's working. I taught in one of those schools just a couple years ago. We had 2 labs with 24 computers, and I had 26 students. And a couple computers were broken all the time. Now, as a teacher, what are you going to do? And you know that your child in your classroom is going to take the same test as the child who's in a classroom with 30 computers for 20 students and 20 extra over in the corner. There's just no fairness to any of this equation, and it's time that everyone step up to the plate. And let me be very clear. I don't want any student in the state of Illinois or anywhere in the United States or the whole world for that matter to suffer with what privileges they have. I just want the playing field to be fair. I want the children from my classroom to have every opportunity to compete to get into the University of Illinois as anyone else in the state of Illinois. I saw it firsthand when my daughter took the ACT to get into the U of I. And she went to the public schools in Decatur. And she competed with the kids from the suburbs of Chicago. And she still got in. But it was despite the situation, not because of the situation. It's not fair. It's not fair. It's not fair. And we have to all work together to make it fair and say, guess what? We're going to quit saying education's our priority, and we are going to make education our priority. Because I can't help people get a job when I go help them at Project Read yesterday and they can't read and they're 30 years old. Well, I want to be a welder, but I can't read the welding plans. We hire felons, but the felon has to be able to read. There's a reason they became a felon in the first place, because they couldn't learn how to read. And they couldn't learn how to read because we wouldn't fund chapter reading anymore. We wouldn't fund reading recovery anymore. Is it fair? It's time to make it fair. That's all I can say about it. It's time to make it fair.
Thank you, Sue. All right, we have two superintendents with us today that are going to say a few remarks. First is Tony Sanders, who is the CEO of Unit 46 School District, which is the second largest district in the state in Elgin. Tony?
Thank you, Senator. Actually, I work for the largest school system in the state of Illinois outside of that one that's just a little bit northwest of us called Chicago. So I'm proud to be the CEO of a school district encompassing 11 different communities, 40,000 students, and I'm here to fully support Senate Bill 1. And I do so not even knowing the impact that Senate Bill 1 will have on our school district. When Senate Bill 16 came forward last year, there was a lot of rhetoric around winners and losers. In the state of Illinois, we've had winners and losers for years and years and years, and it's not school districts, it's kids. If this is done right, I don't have to worry about what the impact will be on my school district. I will know, given our student demographics. 40,000 students, 25% of whom are learning English for the first time, 12% who are special education, 60% of whom are low income. It will have an impact on our school district. But we have to get away from the rhetoric of winners and losers. Again, we've had those for years. I'm proud to be a part of the Funding Illinois Future Coalition, a group of nearly 200 superintendents from across the state who support Senate Bill 1. I will keep my comments brief because I'm in education, not legislation, and just say that the time to change the formula is now. We cannot wait any longer for a fix to Illinois school funding formula. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Garrison. I'm the superintendent of Sandoval Community Unit School District 501. And while we're not a large district in the state, we're actually a small rural state located about 2 hours south of Springfield. But before I share a true problem that we're facing, who better to talk to you than a student from our high school who actually is a student board member. So he attends all of our board meetings each month, and he brings a student voice to the table. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Cade Gamble, who's a junior at Sandoval High School.
Like Dr. Garrison said, my name is Cade Gamble. Good afternoon. I'm a junior at Sandoval High School. Our school district has an enrollment of about 550 students, grades pre-K through 12th grade. And today we are here to talk about a very serious topic concerning many students in Illinois: school funding. Inequitable school funding is a situation plaguing high poverty school districts in Illinois. Without the appropriate amount of funding, high poverty schools are not able to offer an education comparable to wealthier school districts. The education you receive should not be determined by your zip code, but rather by your will and drive to learn. How does the lack of funding affect our schools and communities? In Sandoval, we are forced to make cuts to the school budget in order to keep our doors open. We currently do not offer any courses in art or theater or foreign languages. We have a limited variety of vocational skill courses and few electives that many wealthy schools are able to offer to their students. We are down to the bare bones. Sandoval has made cuts to faculty and administration. Extracurricular programs are led by volunteers. Transportation costs have become the community's burden to bear. Teachers are spending their own money on classroom materials, and the list goes on and on. A proper education should offer many opportunities, not just a few a school can afford because of the insufficient funding it receives. Benjamin Franklin once said, "An investment in knowledge pays the best interest." So let's follow in the words of Benjamin Franklin and invest in the great young minds in the next generation. I urge you to support Senate Bill 1. Thank you.
And just to put everything into perspective, a real story of what our district is facing. We have cut over 20% of our teaching staff. We have cut over 20% of our non-certified staff. Building level administrators, we've cut 50%. And central office staff, we've cut 50%. The dilemma we're faced with is we're living what I call paycheck to paycheck, or state aid payment to state aid payment. And this past year, our boiler that heats our elementary went down. Now the Board of Education is forced with the conversation. We've already cut again, 20%, 20%, over 50% of different staff. So now the conversation is, we don't have a savings, we don't have a fund balance left. How do we find $78,000 so we have heat in our elementary? The next 2 months, our school board, along with our staff, will be having these hard conversations. So again, that just puts things in perspective, that $78,000 might not sound a lot to districts with a healthy fund balance, but for us, a situation like that, this is catastrophic. And we just keep pulling together, and I can't say enough about the school board, the community, my teaching staff, that they are behind Senate Bill 1. We are behind at equity and adequacy, but the high poverty districts need funding, and we do not have time to wait. So we ask for both our senators and representatives to make Senate Bill 1 a reality this year. Thank you.
So in just a couple of closing remarks, we're here early in the session. We have a bill in both the House and the Senate that has been filed in its entirety, which is important, not just to keep discussions moving forward, but to make sure that discussion is part of both the legislative process and the budget process this fiscal year. Again, what is important to us is twofold. Changing the formula to reflect the needs of the state today and investing more money in the state budget behind that formula so that we can begin to phase in these changes in the coming school year, because there are hundreds of districts that are in the same boat as what we just heard in the state. And those are districts that today lose money year to year, despite the fact that more money is invested in the state budget in public education. Those are districts that are victims of today's formula, and those are districts that oftentimes, almost all the time, have higher than average poverty rates, higher than average tax rates. They are making their effort on the local level, but the formula today does not recognize the changes that they've experienced on the local level in the past 17 years. That's why this is so important, to change the formula and invest more at the same time. So with that, I'll be happy to, I think all of us would be happy to answer any questions you have. Carrie.
I have two. One, you've had the State Board of Education run numbers in the past about how this would affect individual districts. Have you done that? And two, last time you and I talked, you had not briefed the governor about changes to the bill. Have you done that yet?
Yeah, we expect that the modeling from the State Board would be released in the near future. That's probably the most vague way I could have just said that, but they're working on it. We've worked cooperatively, our staffs, both the House and the Senate, with the State Board of Education. They have any number of things going on right now, including a budget address in a few weeks and a changeover at the State Board. But I would think it would be okay for me to say that they'll be here shortly. But to the point of winners and losers, which has been made several times, we have winners and losers this year. Despite the fact, again, we invested more in the state budget, there are districts that lost money from the state, and those are the districts that I would argue can least afford to lose state aid. So I want to caution again about printouts, because we proposed a bill in the Senate, in Senate Bill 16, based on what we think is good public policy for the state of Illinois moving forward. So to me, we've had this debate about adequacy and equity and which one should come first and, which one should come second. I think we are saying in a resounding voice that we ought to do them both at the same time this year, because the situation calls for that. It calls for us as legislators to do it. So despite the fact that we're going to have printouts in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I think this is a good bill. And I think it's a better bill because it reflects input from educators across the state. Yeah, I would describe it as an open, positive conversation. I don't speak for the governor by any means, but I leave conversations with the governor and his staff that they understand that the inequity that we face in public education between the haves and the have-nots is a great challenge. I would also say this, we can't solve this without also addressing budget issues in a macro sense in the state. I mean, we can't solve school funding without addressing core issues in the state budget. One's not going to happen without the other. And I think that's an acknowledgement on our part as we begin the session.
And Senator, that leads to my question. You put a price tag on this now, $500 million at least. How do you begin to pay for that? What kind of revenue streams are out there that could possibly begin to fund this?
Well, I'm going to speak for myself on this one, and then anybody else can chime in if you want. But I would say we should put all options on the table for a couple reasons. The sponsors, co-sponsors of the bill in the legislature, we don't use words like that often unless they're deserved. And in this case, I believe it's deserved. We have dire situations when it comes to financial decisions that are being made by school boards right now. They didn't get better over the last year. They got worse. So to me, that calls for a discussion that puts options on the table. Number two, I don't know of anybody who ran for office, for the legislature or for governor, that said, I'm going to go to Springfield and cut schools. So everybody's walking in the door on the same page when it comes to increasing investment, which is something that people here, Leader Lightford, for example, has been saying for years, that we need to increase what we spend, increase investment, and at the same time, spend it better. And that's what we're saying today. And Senate Bill 1, we believe, is the path forward on that. But again, simply spending more doesn't solve the problem. We should reiterate that. And evidenced by the budget this year. Evidenced by the budget this year, where there was a fight in the House and the Senate to increase spending on public education, which we did, which was enacted on July 1st, but the poorest districts lost money. The poorest districts under that scenario lost money. That's an equation that every educator and every legislator, regardless of the district they represent or the school that they walk into every day, should just reject on its face. That should just be rejected on its face. So that's the discussion we should have. Invest more, change the formula.
Andy, excuse me, Senator, can you explain that? I mean, people are going to hear this and go, well, how does that work?
Yeah, it's not
Increase money and yet the poor districts lose money.
It's not logical, right? It's illogical. But that's the world that our school districts live in today. And it's simply a filter, Terry. So how you spend your money is important. And the directions on how money gets from the state budget to the hundreds of school districts in the state almost acts as a filter to preventing the neediest districts from accessing the money that they need the most. And that's a function of the law, which is why this is not just a budgetary conversation, but it's a conversation about what the law says. So I'm of the opinion that the inequity is hardwired into the law today.
Is it a question of deregulating and getting rid of mandates?
No, it's a question of saying that we value we value in our directions for how money is distributed the fact that we have inequity that exists today in the state to the extent that it never has. So we need to value that more in our directions. So Senate Bill 1 is simply changing the directions on how money is distributed. And that, to me, should reflect the needs of the state today, which are very different. Anybody listening or anybody in the room, just think about the changes in the state since 1997. Things have changed sizably, and our state aid formula has literally not changed at all. Yeah.
Can I just add something to that real quick? Terry, I think it's also just kind of a proportion question. So, were some districts under SB 16 that said, hey, we could lose, 70% of our state funding under this. Well, but if it's only 2% of your entire funding, that doesn't hurt you as hard. So part of the problem is under proration, which, we've had for many, many years, districts that are in the lowest quintile get hurt 5 times as much as districts in the highest quintile by proration. So because of that, because of how much your reliance on state funding matters and varies differently between districts, that's why some districts get hurt so much more than others.
Senator, I don't see any lawmakers who are Republicans who are from what you might call the wealthier areas. How are you going to sell them, assuming you would even need to?
Well, this clearly has to be a bipartisan effort. I would go back to the EFAC effort in the Senate, where there were 8 members of the Senate, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, who signed a report which led to the drafting of Senate Bill 16. But moving forward, it's clear to me that this has to be a bipartisan effort. There's shared government today in Illinois. There's a Republican in the executive branch. There's still Democrats that hold sizable majorities in both the House and the Senate. But we should make this a bipartisan effort. I don't think there's too many people in the building, Democrat or Republican, that think that the way we do things today is worth preserving. So that brings about the question, how are we going to change it and how do we get there?
Yeah, you think you've changed it enough to get, just name a name, somebody like Matt Murphy on board with it. Just name a name.
I'm not sure if this is going to do that trick, but this should be a bipartisan effort. You know, if we can advance a bipartisan bill that Governor Rauner can sign to begin to make these changes in this coming school year, that to me ought to be our goal. That's my personal goal. I think that's the goal of the sponsors in the House and the Senate. But that calls for bipartisan action. That also calls for engagement and a discussion. And, you know, simply saying that we're going to resist change for the sake of resisting change isn't going to get us to the place where we need to go, in my opinion. So, you know, there's a lot of ideas, and I would say to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in both chambers, let's hear them. How do we change that? First, let's recognize that's a problem. Second, how do we change it?
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.